Okay, well, the hour is upon us, and I think everybody is coming in right at the same time. So glad you guys are with us. I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and mute. As in other master classes, Robin will be speaking for about 45 minutes or so. But as he's speaking, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. And at the end of his presentation, we will review those questions. So we're really excited, Robin, that you've offered to do this. I know you have years and years of experience with working with people through stages of grief, and of course are beloved by our congregation, and what you've done for us through the parish visitor position. And we're just excited to have you do this tonight. So I'm going to open us in prayer. Gracious Lord, we thank you and praise you for this day, for the opportunity to gather together on Zoom. We thank you for this technology and for ways that we can learn from one another. And we pray, Lord, that you would be with us and open our ears and eyes and lives to what Robin has to share with us tonight. Bless him with your spirit, and may your presence abide with us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Robin, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Valina. It's good to see everyone. Golly, I haven't seen some of these people for quite a while, and it's nice. I miss it. That's one of my losses, is the loss of relationship at the church. And yeah, I still have some, obviously, but that's where we are today, isn't it? And I guess that's one of the reasons Valina asked me to talk with you. The title I put together was Mourning Our Pandemic Losses. So what I'd like to start with is, well, let me just first say, I'm guessing that most the people that are on this Zoom meeting are here for one of three reasons. One, you may be currently grieving a loss of a loved one, perhaps, or you have a loss of something else in the midst of this pandemic. Or you simply like the title and you thought it might be interesting to set in. For whatever reason, I'm very, very happy that you're with us. Welcome. And if you're in the midst of mourning right now, a loss, my sincere condolences to you. I hope there might be something that I could share tonight that would help you in the midst of that mourning, and others who might be mourning something other than a death loss. My goal is to help each of you better understand grief and loss, and then address it, either personally or helping others in the midst of their grief. So I'm going to do a few slides. And the first one that we're going to put up is what I call the landscape of losses. And there it is. First off is death losses. And obviously that's the most apparent. You can't get away from it. If you turn on a television and watch any news, you'll hear how many people have died of COVID. I think we're at about 451,000 people in the United States have died from COVID, which kind of chokes me up every time I say that number. I'm also not real pleased that it just seems like a cold number to me, because we know behind that are a lot of people who are left to mourn that loved one. In fact, I just read a recent study about the fact that the study showed that 9 people should be considered to be impacted in a big way every time a death occurs. That's an average. And that's an average of what they call the kinship network. It's parents and grandparents, siblings, spouses, and children. It doesn't even include friends. And, there's big loss for friends too, who have lost loved ones. I'll say loved ones, because if it's like in the church, we've lost some loved ones here in just the last few months. So those deaths immediate, let's talk about other deaths that have occurred. Certainly, deaths are still going on throughout the pandemic for other causes. There's natural causes, heart ailments, cancer, car crashes. There's more car crashes now than there were before. I didn't understand that, but and deaths related to car crashes. Where it comes from was fewer people were driving, so there's less cars on the road, and people are going faster, and they're crashing into each other. Unfortunately, that's what I read in the studies. But obviously, they go too. And the problem with all this is that these are the times when people can't even, as you know, can't even go into the hospital because of the spread of the coronavirus. So you're dealing with families that are absent from the bedside during the course of those deaths, whether it's COVID or another cause. Um, there's little collective recognition of these deaths. We have had a few memorial services, if you will, lately, but for me, still, it's almost like 450,000 people have died, and we haven't really, in my mind, respected and honored it. So I'm hoping that there's going to be something along those lines in the time to come. Um, the delayed or no funerals in our topic tonight, grief and loss and mourning our losses without having funerals. Now we have had some at First Pres, some beautiful ones, but you know what they miss, of course, is the opportunity to really share and have a collective approach to sharing your sorrow and your condolences with the family. We miss that. We miss no receptions. This is not a reflection on our church or any church. It's what it is today. But these also cause us not to get going with our mourning because they haven't had that ability to say go through the beautiful receptions that we would do at First Pres, for example. Um, and also a major loss in the midst of that is what I call hugging support. Hugging each other is a vital part of helping people begin to mourn. They know they're loved and they know they're cared for. So these other deaths too have those same impact in terms of lacking those normal funeral rituals. Um, I have a second item there called disenfranchised pandemic losses. And what I call disenfranchised is those who are experiencing a loss that is not socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. Um, there's too many of these to really cover them all. I'll share a few ideas for what I think are disenfranchised. I mean, we've had thousands of people lose their jobs. That's a loss. That's a loss to be grieved and a loss to be mourned. Small businesses in particular, and even some large businesses have gone out of business. And with it, obviously, a lot of people are put out of work. And thus, their inability to have a financial compatibility, they or capability, they're not able to earn a living. And when that happens, then they lose a lot of their self-identity. It's hung up in our jobs. That's true for everybody, I think. Um, the food insecurity issue is a loss. People are even having trouble getting food from the food banks. There's major problems with that in the midst of this pandemic. I heard a statistic the other day that 1 in 7 families, that seems to be not right, but it was a good source. 1 in 7 families have trouble putting food on the table. And that's a real basic loss, obviously. Uh, Looking at mortgages and rental matters that you can't, if you're unemployed, you're not going to be able to do that. That's a major loss and a major piece of anxiety for folks too. And another big one that I'll add is the whole issue with schools and school attendance, education and the relationships with others. I think of from preschool all the way up through colleges. I think particularly about adolescence and knowing what those friends mean to them and how important that is. But it is what it is, so to speak. I think we're now getting back into in-person education, it sounds like, and I think that'll be a real help. There's an example of this that I heard. I was in a webinar with a really scholarly grief and loss expert who, her name is Darcy Harris, who shared a story about her own life and her own family. Her daughter was a senior. She was getting ready for the prom. This was last spring before as the pandemic was just really starting. And she went shopping for a prom dress, and she bought that prom dress. She came home, and she that evening had a modeling chance with mom and dad to put on the prom dress and come down and look beautiful in their minds and in her mind. And she had this big smile on her face, and then suddenly her whole demeanor changed. And she got real serious, and she looked at her mom and dad and she says, "I'm not ever going to have a chance to wear this, am I?" And she was right, because many of those events, if not most of those events, were canceled. Now that doesn't sound like much of a loss in the scheme of things, but for her, it was a really big loss that needed support and needed to be mourned. And we can't forget about all that the pandemic has done in that regard. And to sum up these losses, it's just the accumulation of them that's really given us a hard time. Our inability to choose our daily living, the fear of getting sick, of loss of sleep, of being ever vigilant with everything that we do. Certainly going to the grocery store is an example of that. And the one thing too that I need to say is the effect of this pandemic on people struggling with mental health issues. We even know, I learned the other day of what they're now calling, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Can't find it now. Deaths of despair. Deaths of despair, like addictions have occurred, and there's been a lot more overdoses and a number of suicides that wouldn't have happened other than with the pandemic. So those are things also that we have to consider. So that's enough about the losses. I want to move on and talk about how we might address some of these. So first, I wanted to talk about grief and mourning is the next slide. Valina, thanks. I use very simple definitions because I think if they're simple enough for me to understand, hopefully everybody can understand it. The definition I have, I like to use for grief is the thoughts and feelings experienced internally. These are your individual feelings about a loss. I don't know about them until you choose to share them with me or with others. That's where the grief definition comes from. You probably have heard of the 5 stages of grief, or 5 steps of grief, 5 stages of grief, from denial up to acceptance. I need to address this because this research was done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the 1960s. She kind of brought death out of the closet, which was a good thing. But the problem with that research was, as some of you may know, it didn't really deal with grieving family members or grieving the bereavement process. Her studies dealt with terminally ill patients. When those patients received a terminal diagnosis, what did they go through in terms of trying to accept it? Those steps or those stages were real orderly and predictable. Grief isn't that way. And so I think a lot of us in this field have talked about trying to move people gently away from the 5 stages of grief because they really don't apply to people in mourning. So what's mourning? Mourning is the external expression of grief. You take what you have had in your heart and in your soul and somehow communicate it publicly. I got a couple examples up here: praying, crying, talking, journaling, and celebrating. All of those are important. Praying either with others or by yourself or with God directly. Crying crying is a very good approach to mourning. And in this culture, we try to hold back on a lot of that. We're not seen as being strong or keeping our chin up. And yet it's vital, I think, for people to, as they are led, to feel, to go ahead and cry. Um, Talking can be with professionals, or it could be with just friends, neighbors, and companions. Journaling is a great way to express mourning and celebrating through recognizing and remembering the loved one. And these also can also apply to non-death losses as well. Think about it with regard to a job that you've held for 20 years that you don't have anymore. I think you could do with that too. Use these, what I'm about to show you, this model. Um, Over the holidays, I, like probably many of you, watched It's a Wonderful Life. That's about the 50th time for me, I think. And, I noticed something in it this year that I didn't see as much before or pay much attention to. Jimmy Stewart plays George Bailey. And one of the scenes, he comes out from his office there at the Bailey building in Yalone, and he's got a black armband on his suit jacket to tell him that my dad died. His dad died in that movie. Uh, that black armband told everybody he saw that day that he was mourning. Absent that, we probably don't know it. With it, we're going to have people approach him and ask him how he's doing, giving him an opportunity to mourn. But our culture now has kind of put that away. Women used to wear, I think, black dresses or clothing in showing mourning, but for whatever reason, the United States got away from that. So what do we do? How do we actually mourn, and how do we approach that? Um, when I was at Life Not Health, and we can put that up now, Belina, if you'd like, the 6 reconciliation needs of mourners. When I was at LifeNet Health, I was asked to put together a bereavement support program for the families of organ and tissue donors. And I had been a Stephen minister at our church. And so I knew some of the stuff about mourning and loss for whatever reason, and how to be with people in the midst of that. But I was looking for a model, a system, a way of simply simplifying the process to people so that they could have kind of a goal or a way in which they would proceed with their mourning. And this is what I found. This is 6 reconciliation needs of mourning. It was put together by Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who I considered my mentor. I've studied under him, and I really do believe that he is on to something with this. Dr. Alan Wolfelt is at the Center for Loss and Life Transition that's out in Fort Collins, Colorado. And he's given me permission to use this anytime I want to. So I'm taking advantage of that tonight as well. So let's go through each of these, and I'll give some examples as I go through them that hopefully brings it home to you to really understand it in some depth. Now, this is generally written for those for death losses, but I've added the or loss at the end of some of these, acknowledging the reality of the death or the loss, if it's a job for you. I keep using that as an example since that's a major loss. So what does that mean? Most people, if you read that straight out, acknowledging the reality of the death, you'll probably ask yourself, well, why? Why is that hard? You've been told by a doctor that he's died or she's died. What's so hard about it? I think it's hard, very much, very difficult particularly when the death might be a sudden and unexpected death. And some of these COVID, you can interpret them that way. I mean, the stories I see, people are dealing with, an illness unknown early on. We know a lot more now, but, so I'm hearing stories of whether they're medically asked to go to the hospital or not. Some aren't. And they start doubting, well, if I would have pushed harder to have them go into the hospital sooner, These if onlys are a big deal for mourners, and they can carry these for months or years. They need a place where they can really speak with someone to get that out, if you will, to mourn that loss and to mourn and understand better and acknowledge the reality of the death. We used to do training for critical care nurses in across Virginia and even into our hospitals through LifeNet Health that we worked with out in Washington State and even in Florida. Um, One of the classes I went to, and I held this first reconciliation need up, and I had a nurse in the back raise her hand and say, "Oh, I've got an example of that." I said, "Well, let's hear it, because those examples are really powerful." Well, in her case, she was talking about a promotion she had a couple years before, and she was very, very proud of this promotion. And she just said, as soon as she heard about it, she said, "I'm going to call mom." And she gets up from the table and she gets the phone and she starts to dial, and she stops and she realizes her mom died 2 months ago. What she was experiencing, in a way, it was nice because she was remembering her mom. That's a good thing. The troubling thing is she's still working on this reality, acknowledging the reality of the death. So these are really not, they're not really orderly and predictable stages like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross put together. These are more wave-like. They can come and go. They ebb and flow. Let me move to the second one, embracing the pain of the loss. I think this is probably one of the hardest things to possibly do. Um, Again, we use the word reconciliation, and what we mean there is, how do we meet that need to reconcile that in our life and move forward with our life? One of the things we said all the time is we want to help people mourn well so they can then live well and love well. And unless they mourn well, we don't think they're really going to do that. So how do you embrace the pain of the loss? It's not easy. uh, what do you do when you have an illness and you're in pain? Many of us will go to the drugstore and get something to take for the pain, or we'll call a doctor and try to get a prescription for it. Problem with grief is you can't heal grief that way. You can take something, you can take something to take the edge off, so to speak. The problem is that one's got to be guarded. I mean, we have to be really conscious that you don't do that so much, and you don't self-medicate to take away from the pain, to hide it, to bury it. That's not going to help you in the long run in terms of reconciling that loss in your life. I hope that makes some sense. It will not go away unless you become well acquainted with it. Now, you can't do that all at one time. You're going to have to kind of dose that. In other words, feel that pain, know it's there, think through it. One of the words Dr. Wilfot uses, befriend it. I think that's a little much, but befriend it. And then, but not dwell in it. Take a walk after that, listen to beautiful music, something. One of the examples I had in terms of embracing the pain was a young woman, a mother who had lost a young child. And she called us to say, when she goes to the grocery store and walks down the cereal aisle, her eye always catches that favorite cereal of her daughter, and she just cannot handle it. It gives her such pain that she can't stand it. Well, what's her answer? Is not to not go to the grocery store. She has to go there, and probably not to not go to the cereal aisle. We have to help her talk through that to the point where she can navigate knowing her daughter's favorite cereal is there. And maybe she spins it in terms of a joyful situation. Maybe she can remember that daughter smiling the day she had her Lucky Charms or whatever it might have been, some way to allow her to integrate that or to reconcile the loss. Let's move on to the remembering one. Mourners need to remember who and what they've lost. We like to say, in helping them, we hope that we can help them transfer the loving relationship of presence to the loving relationship of memory. loving relationship of presence, having them in your life, versus the loving relationship of memory. That love it continues. Um, we can't have them lose sight of that. But remembering is the number one thing we tried to do at LifeNet Health. Help people try to remember their loved ones. Um, encourage the ways that we did that. We encouraged them to tell us about their loved one, about their stories, about their memories, and then to honor those tears. My example of this is a bad example, but I'm going to give you that to show you what maybe you don't want to do. We had one gentleman who lost a child, and he left the funeral service early so that he could go home and take down all the pictures of that child. He was afraid his wife would cry. The mother of this child will cry every time she sees it. She probably will for the first couple months or so. But not doing that was going to be really hurting her in terms of needing to remember. I mean, she's always going to remember, but seeing that child that way is a helpful way to her, for her to begin to mourn that child. And I like to think when people do things like that, and there's a lot of them in our culture, they're certainly well intended, but they're misinformed. Had he known this, he wouldn't have done that. And I'm sure he replaced the pictures back when they had a talk about that. Let's go to the next one, developing a new identity, new self-identity. Mourners become new people, really. A part of you, a part of the person who's mourning is gone. And they need to work through how they will reestablish that new person that they've become. My example there is a really simple one, and I don't mean it to be trivial, but there are things I learned in LifeNet from families that I just it wasn't really in my era, but there were people who, like for example, one of the spouses died and the other spouse, survivor spouse, didn't even know what day garbage day was because they never did it. That's how you assign, household responsibilities. Same with paying bills. One spouse typically had it in a lot of families, and the other spouse had to develop a new self identity to begin doing that. And some of this you feel helpless or inadequate because you never did it and it's so simple. But that becomes something they have to actually fix, if well, not fix, that's a bad word, but actually reconcile in their life to be able to do it and do it well without having that helplessness or inadequacy. Searching for meaning is one I think hits home for all of us as believers in the church and as people of faith. It's actually questioning the meaning and purpose of your life now, because if this loss has been so near and dear to you, you have to decide, where does this put me now? That loved one is gone. It often brings in those faith-based questions of why God? I had one mother who had a teenage daughter who was killed in an automobile accident. And she told me she prayed every day for her safety. And when she died, she really did lose her relationship with God. The good news was, for that one and a lot that I've had after a lot of work, they realized later that God is always with them. And it sometimes takes quite a long time to see that. There's a lot of adversity that they're living with, but so many, in my experience, can turn that into positivity. And then the final one is receiving ongoing support. Draw on the encouragement and the experiences of others, and that realizing mourning really is a necessity for months and possibly even years. My example of this was a beautiful one in my mind. I was working with an older man in his 50s, maybe he's in his early 60s. I wasn't that there. I am now, but when I was there, he seemed a little more old than I was. But he and his wife died, and he and his wife would go to Costco regularly. He told me it was like every week or every other week. I think really what it was a date day. Really, it wasn't a really shopping trip. Although they did look around and get some things they needed, but they were together that often, that regular. When she died, he couldn't go there. He just said, "I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it." He eventually did. And I was very excited to hear what his response, what he was going to go through and how it happened for him, how it worked for him. He called me up and said, "Well, Robin, I did it. I went there." I said, "Well, how'd it go?" He said, "Not good. I got that big basket and I went down halfway the first aisle and I said, I can't do this." And he just left. He left the cart right in the aisle and he went out into his car and he wept. The thing about receiving ongoing support is to have someone at times like that. And he called up a friend that he had, a very good friend, and he started telling him about this experience. Um, and he said, "I'm not going to say this is all bad because he really helped me think through that and work through it. And I think I can go back there again." So I think that's a wonderful way of thinking of how important that ongoing support is. I think I'm looking at time. I think I have time to do another one of those examples there because this one is a good one too. I worked with a woman named Ann. And I don't think she'd have problems with me. That's her real name. I'm going to say it. She lived out in Gloucester in that neighborhood. And her son died of it was in college and died of an asthma attack. He became an organ and tissue donor. And I worked with Ann and her husband, Bob, quite a bit. Ann lived in this Gloucester neighborhood where it was possible to leave her doors open in the summer. Um, I never lived like that, but I think it was very, very nice. She would tell me that she occasionally had what she called Stephen days. That was the name of their son. Stephen days were when she couldn't do anything, and she was in such pain as a result from the loss. This particular day, she sat on the couch. That's all she did in the living room. And not long after she sat down, a person came in, one of her friends that lived in the neighborhood, and she sat on the couch with her. And time went on and on and on. She stayed about 40 minutes or so. They didn't say one word to each other. She was there to let Anne do whatever she needed to do in terms of cry or wail or whatever it was to mourn the loss of her son, Stephen. She got up at the end of that 40 minutes and she walked over to the door and she leaned back and looked at her and she said, "I'll be back again." And Anne told me that was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. And Anne did very, very well in reconciling her needs. So that's the 6 needs of mourners. I hope you can see the process that they can bring into someone who's really lost a close loved one. Or I think there's a way to actually do it for non-death losses as well. I had the privilege a number of years ago to speak with the Celebrate Recovery group that used to be held at First Pres. And I showed this model to them. And, a lot of people in there, I believe, were dealing with addiction issues or other mental health issues. I had several people come up afterwards and saying, "I like that model. I think I can use that. I think I can use that for dealing with issues that I haven't been able to deal with yet." So that made me feel really good that this model could be used in that way as well. So let's move on. I'm going to talk here briefly about faith. Where does our faith enter into grief and mourning? There are 32 references to grief in the Bible. There's 47 references to mourning. I could have selected all kinds of reading material from the Old and New Testament. I've picked just 3, 2 very short ones, and one not so short, but tells a wonderful story. I'm sure many of the people, if not all the people on this call, might know these passages. I'm sure you do, but I want to, if I can, go ahead and read the first one, which is the First Samuel story. And this is the story of Hannah. A little, as Jim uses it, a little context. Hannah is going with her husband to, according to the Bible, the house of the Lord, house of the Lord. The Bible tells us earlier, I'm not going to read that verse, but the Bible tells us that the Lord has closed her womb. And that to me means she has severe fertility issues. And at that time, and at this time, even our current time, that's a major, major loss for this young woman. I'm going to read it starting, I think I have on there starting at verse 12. Oh, I do have it at 12. Yep, that's where I want to start. 12 to 17, chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli was the priest of this congregation. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. They were eating and drinking outside here, outside the place where they are. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of great anguish and grief." And Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." I use that story because we just went through the reconciliation needs of mourners. What a what an incredible way for that woman to mourn this loss that she had, and to own it, to tell the priest, "You're not right. That's not what I'm doing. I'm doing this," and explains it to him. And for him then, I'll give him some credit too there, to come back and say, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Later in the story, it says that Hannah, her face was no longer downcast. So that really meant a lot to her. I think it's a great example of someone helping a person right in the midst of mourning. The rest of that story, obviously, many of you know it well, is an incredible story and a beautiful story of God's love to us, as well as mourning and companioning the bereaved. Gospel of John, um, and this one doesn't even mention grief or loss or mourning. I do want to read it though, and I'm going to explain that later. Jesus is speaking. "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another." I'll explain it in a moment. And then finally from Matthew 5:4, that's from the Beatitudes, the number 2 Beatitude. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." I've read that since I started preparing for this over and over again. We know God's comforting. We know God's part of this. We know Christ is with us. But that doesn't mean we can't be responsible for helping to comfort as well. All it says is for they will be comforted. It doesn't say by who. And I guess my point would be we as the church can play a major role in helping to comfort people in this kind of distress. The next slide, Valina, I wanted to talk about takeaways from this talk before we get into questions. Basically, it's pretty simple. I mean, if you're currently in mourning, I know I've emphasized the need to express your grief. I would suggest you try looking at these needs and see if that might give you more clarity about how you might go about doing that. To dose that pain, don't get so into it that it will burn you out. This is very, very hard. They don't call grief work because it's easy. It's very hard, but dose that pain. And preferably find someone you can talk with. It doesn't have to mean a professional. Professional would be fine, but I'm concerned in this time we're in now, it may be hard to find people. And some people don't have a health plan that would cover it or don't have the money that they could pay for it. Find someone you know and trust and won't judge you over what you might be able to tell them in your mourning. For those of you that would like to help folks mourn, I've used this term, be a ministry of presence. That's generally used for chaplains, which certainly offer that. But I think we as church members can do the same thing. And you do a lot of that through active listening. That, that quote there at the bottom of that slide, I used this in our training for critical care nurses. They told me unanimously that this was one of this quote was one of the best things they actually learned from us. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Being heard is so close to being loved. So where I'm going with that is that message from that we read earlier from John, that we love one another, I think underscores the importance of how important it is in listening to people and listening to them well and advancing their health as a result. I have a couple, I have next slide has a few websites that might be of help to you. And Valina tells me we can send these out. If you don't get to write them down right now, we can send these out to you. Just email her, or you can email me as well if you'd like. And we'd be sure to get you the slides. The centerforloss.com is Dr. Wilfelt's website. And on that website, he has dozens and dozens of books that he's written for most every occasion in mourning, including non-loss mourning. If you feel that might be helpful, I'd invite you to take a look at what he's got there and see if there's something that would help you. Griefshare.com, there was a story in the newspaper of just a few weeks ago about GriefShare. GriefShare is a grief support group that's used primarily in churches. And the reason I still put it up there, I know we don't use it right now, but there are churches in Norfolk that do. And if you go to that website, you can actually search on where their courses are being held through, if we have folks from out of Norfolk or even out of Hampton Roads. Facebook. I know a lot of people don't use Facebook anymore. They're tired of it. But I will say I went on there, I heard about this in a webinar I attended, and I went on there to look up COVID loss, and is all I did. And there are a number of support groups. It wasn't dealt, for example, with pregnancy during the pandemic and all the issues that are associated with that. I don't know what they are, but there are a lot of groups on there that you might find that would be helpful. And then another website I heard about is mindfulnessandgrief.com. Mindfulness is a big concept that is being talked about now, especially as we're isolated in our homes for so long and becoming irritable and anxiety piling on and that kind of thing. Mindfulness talks about maybe bringing back to your own mind kind of a healing influence, knowing that there is safety, knowing that you can be safe, and that we have been through, as difficult as this is, we've been through things like it before, and we'll go through this one as well. So you may find some help there, I hope. The last one I'm almost embarrassed to put in here, but I want to tell a story about it. Valina and Jim and the staff have done a wonderful job with this Better Tomorrow journal. I don't know how many of you might be using it. I did. And one of the things that in my reflection in here about mind, body, and spirit, I really did want to put a blog together and put some of my thoughts and reflections out there, and thinking that if there's one or two people that I might help in this world through this process, I'm going to do it. So with my daughter, Sarah, who helped me immensely, I've put together a blog. It's my website is called my name, robincowherd.com. When you go there, you'll see my blog right on the front page. I've called it At Peace, Compassion and Peace in a Confusing World. And so you'll see more. Right now, there's only like 3 or 4 posts in there, but I intend to do more work around what we just talked about this evening, ways in which we can either help those who are mourning or that people who are mourning can get some benefit from. So I have about 7:45, so that's pretty good, right, Valina, for possible questions?
Yes. So I'm going to take need to go into the chat room. We don't have any questions right now. So Robin, we had talked before the class that it might be nice for you to share some more stories, because I think the stories are so helpful.
Let me see if I can find them that I didn't use. By the way, I'm thinking through those now. Let me tell another quick story about this concept of disenfranchised lost. And this was from another real professional, big time professional in grief and loss. And his name is Ken Doka. For any of you that might be in the medical community, you might have heard about him. But Ken was in a webinar, or was leading a webinar, and I tuned into it. And he was talking about a situation that he himself had personally. This was rather early in the pandemic, but he had lost an aunt. His aunt died. He was very, very close to his aunt, so he had a tremendous relationship with her and was quite sad and was in the position of wanting really to mourn her. So he was talking with a colleague. This colleague says to him or asks him, "Oh, Ken, was it COVID?" And he said, "No, she was quite elderly. She had been ill, but she finally succumbed to the illness that she had." And the guy says, "Oh, okay." And he turns around and walks away. I mean, it was an opportunity for him to have helped this learned man who was looking for help. And he said, frankly, he felt like this guy blew him off. That's a disenfranchised loss for sure. I mean, he had a loss in the family, and yet that man was only interested in knowing a little bit about how the COVID situation was working, which I thought was terrible. But he told it. He's a smart, smart man. Let's see if I have any others. Do we have any questions yet?
Nope, keep talking.
No, I was worried about running out of time. Let me see. I told you about the husband taking down the pictures. I told you about garbage and bill paying. Oh, well, I have one from my sister. My sister calls up. My sister lives in one of the best states for vaccinations, by the way, West Virginia. She lives in West Virginia, and she called me, and she had something on her mind. She was really getting fed up with this grocery store um, um, safety things. They need to be safe, no doubt about it. But she was going into this process of saying, well, she called it suiting up. I suit up to go to the grocery store, which meant, she probably wore gloves and wore a mask, which she needed to do, obviously. But what she got there, she told me these stories about, we talked earlier about, what was the word I used? The hyper vigilant behavior. Well, she would go in there, reluctant to get within 6 feet of anybody, and looking at people like in the produce who are using their hands to look at all the different stalks of celery, let's say. Now she wanted celery. She was reluctant to go in and get celery now because these guys had fiddled with the celery. So, I had to kind of work with her for this disenfranchised loss that isn't socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. That was the definition of that disenfranchised loss. To remind her of the importance of all that, and maybe she could just wait a while for the celery. Anyway, that's the way that one went. Trying to think.
Got some questions here,
Sure.
Robin. First one is, how does God use loss?
Oh, I knew I'd get a question like this. That's a hard question. And I was hoping there'd be pastors on this call. How does God use loss? Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind, and in fact, I had it to talk about, and I didn't, was, well, I did. I referenced a little bit about the beauty of searching for meaning and people that, from the loss of their loved one, learned how to be a better person. Now, if I said to them, well, you can get your loved one back or be a better person, they want their loved one back. There's no doubt about that. They will still mourn that lost loved one. But the death ultimately made them better people. I had people coming who had, well, for example, we were in the organ donation field. And so I would have people that came in and talked with our new employees. These were what we call donor mothers and donor fathers, would come in and talk with people in health tables at various festivals we'd have about the importance of donating organs. And who knows how many people they may have talked with who changed their mind about that and saved people's lives in the process. I don't, I don't, I don't know if that's really getting at how God uses loss. I don't know that it was God, but it came together in
Mm,
that way.
Right.
You
Thank
can
you.
you offer a thought, Felina?
No, I like your thoughts. Um, the, so this is from Judith Brown. Interesting question. Um, why do very few obituaries mention the cause of death? In the
Mhm.
case of COVID-related deaths, could saying that be of help, or would it be harmful in some way?
Oh, that's a great question. And I've wondered that myself. I read them every morning. A few do mention it. Would it be of help? Well, I I think I think some families may be. I'm just making an assumption here. I think some families may see that um, ultimately being a problem for them, because people almost see that as a scar or something. Um, I mean, there's got to be a reason for why they don't put it in there. I think it would be of help. I think if you think about, well, I spoke with that person 3 weeks before, and if it's been 3 weeks, and you might want to think about getting a test done. I don't know. Um, I think there's some fear on the part of the families in not putting COVID in there.
Yeah. Okay.
It's
This
not a
is
real good answer. It's right off the top of my head.
this is from Jeff Abney. He writes, too many times I hesitate to acknowledge someone's loss when I see them for fear I may interrupt one of their few moments of peace. Any advice?
Mm. Well, Jeff, I think you need to get a feel for that. I mean, if you sense that they really are in a moment of peace, then probably not going into any depth on it. I mean, maybe you could simply say, if this was a recent death, I know you've had a loss, and if at any point I can be of help, please let me know. That leaves it kind of open door, and that you're interested in helping to be a companion for that person. Uh, um, that could also lead to an answer like, no, I can talk. I'd love to talk with you now. Is it okay?
Mhm.
But it gives them kind of the control to really answer that question for you. I just want to have a moment of peace right now.
Great, thank you. Another question, what comments do you have about isolation during these times and the loss of community?
Oh. Well, I've sort of alluded to it some. One in terms of in terms of the church. I think, help me, Jim or Valina, but I think you said since we opened up, we typically have, like, did I hear 20% of our congregation comes to in-service?
Yeah,
Uh,
between 20 and
yeah.
30. Hmm.
Well, so that's 80 or 70 or 80 that don't, that I'm gonna guess maybe are quite isolated. I know, there has been the care team. I know there are deacons. I know there's a lot of people, obviously the pastors and the staff are trying to keep in close touch with everyone. But no, I think there's a major impact for isolation socially. And I wonder, I really wonder how, when we open up, I'll say when, not if, when we open up not only the church but other things. I think about going to get my first meal at a restaurant. I don't know when I'm going to do that, even once they allow every, the full seating and so forth. I, I don't know if that helps, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. Here's another good question. Any thoughts on helping children with loss?
There are some incredible, I mentioned the website for Dr. Wolfelt. He's written some awesome books on helping children with loss. It's basically a guideline that would have you understand the different age settings. I did some work with this when I was at LifeNet Health. There's a lot of good books out there that talk to you in terms of the different age ranges and what children typically could be responsive to in those age ranges and what you might want to say. One of the things I will say that I've had real good success in saying is be very honest. Talk to children depending on, again, the age level and what they can understand. But be very honest about saying death. I've even heard some crazy stories about telling a child that their grandma passed away. They don't understand what passed away was. They might understand what death is, and then that they're not going to be coming back, that they were ill or whatever, how much you'd like to share. But for the real true help, I'd recommend Dr. Wolfelt. Or, he has in a lot of funeral homes, they have bought articles of his that they often carry online. You can go there and see if they have questions and answers that might help you in that regard.
Great, thank you, Robin. Any words of, so we've got maybe just a couple minutes. I'm just wondering if there are any last words or things that you would want to encourage us with.
Yeah, well, I just underscore again the fact that I think everybody can be a caregiver. I don't think that a lot of people are concerned that you do something wrong. I think if you're being present to people, the example I gave of the woman sitting for 40 minutes with a bereaved person, with a bereaved friend, that's a classic example of just being there for someone. And the value of that cannot be overstated. So we're in a time, I guess that sets me up for a good ending that I actually had and I didn't use, was my worry or my fear that we talked about numbers in the beginning. 450,000 people dead. That leads to at least 4 million people that are going to be grieving. I worry that we're not going to have enough people to go around to help all these people. I suspect everybody in this call knows somebody, perhaps, who has died or at least having a really hard time with the pandemic, to just be there and go back to the Gospel of John again and love one another. And you can do that sometime by just listening, reflecting back to those people what they're saying so they understand that. A lot of times I used to do that and they said, I said that. People, when they're mourning in the early stages, they're going to ramble and they're just going to go with these if onlys and things of that nature. And when you refeed it back to them, that will be something that they really appreciate. I hope that helps.
It does, Robin. Thank you so much for being with us and for the insight that you've given. It's not an easy topic to cover, but one that is very relevant for us. And we've been blessed by what you've shared. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you guys are interested, if you didn't get the websites that Robin shared, just email me at valina@fpcnorfolk.org. I'll be glad to send you all of the slides or just that one slide with the information. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Great presentation.